In theory, you should be hearing me a little bit better now. We'll find out. I'm not positive of that myself. We'll see what we get going. Hey, Merry Christmas Eve, whatever the fuck you celebrate. It happens to be a thing I celebrate. So that's what we're doing. That's how we're set up. That's why the festive fingernail colors. But the kids are out. They're out for a few hours. They're out with mom buying stocking stuffers for dad, which will mean I'll get Play-Doh and socks. I probably won't get socks. Probably Play-Doh. I'm going to guess Play-Doh. Dexter's 7. He's been in a place right now where he is buying gifts for himself, ostensibly for other people. He tried to get me to buy, the homies, the little, they're now 75 cents in little quarter machines. That's call back to maybe, I don't know if everyone in the world knows these, trying to convince me to buy those for his mom. So, it's a whole thing. But hello, everyone. It's great to have you. Great to do this. We're moving into Chapter 4 for Anti-Oedipus. How the fuck does that feel? I hope it feels good. I mean, I really hope it feels good. My subtitles are all fucked up. I've got to figure this whole thing out. I've got a new subtitle thing going on. You can't really see it. It's very, very tiny right now. Apparently, I fucked it up. I know why. It's because I did this. So, by request, we have a let's see. Audio is a bit low. There we go. Better. By request, a handful of people who don't necessarily follow along as well. They hit me up. They're like, hey, we'd love some text going. So you've got that below me now. So that way my long rambles, you get to go ahead and enjoy just like everyone else and read along even. If it functions. It's been hit or miss. We'll find out. Yeah, that's not great, is it? That's close enough. It's keeping up somewhat. But we're moving into Chapter 4. Chapter 4 of Anti-Oedipus is fascinating. Let me get us into our Discord. And let me go ahead and start that event up. The reboot has been a journey in Discord, to say the least. But that's fine. So here's the setup as we move into Chapter 4. There's a lot of stuff inside of Chapter 4 that necessarily I'm going to take a lot more time with than people might expect. Stuff that seems simpler, but they're actually making some incredibly grand statements kind of throughout. So as we make our setup, 1 second, I have to fix the thing on the Discord again. This is just wonderfully annoying. My favorite thing to do. Let's see. All right. All right. So we'll go ahead and just probably jump in and just get moving. The core setup is exciting here. I'm jazzed. I'm jazzed to get into schizoanalysis. I did make a little stream up there. If you got a couple extra bucks and you want the stream to go long, feel free. I am going to have a hard stop at 2 o'clock. If it doesn't go over because it's a fucking holiday evening. I've got cooking to do. I've got a rib roast to start up. A whole bunch of different things. And different chapters are translated by different people. There's a long conversation to have around the translation, to say the least. But we'll make our way through this. So the introduction to schizoanalysis is going to open with the social field. One of the biggest deals of Anti-Oedipus. And there's a lot of big deals in here, but one of the big ones when people ask, like, well, what does it mean for me? How does it help me? What does it help for an analyst and an analysand? That big focus, one of the big ones, is to understand that repression doesn't start personally. When we talk about the nature of repression, it begins socially. So when you have a Jordan Peterson or Anthony Robbins or any of these people who talk about how fixing you starts with you, it doesn't. Fixing you starts with the social field, how the social field operates, how it comes to you, and how it sets up. Wigard New Translation is coming along incredibly slowly. It's a thing I've been wanting to focus on more, but it's a solid, to do a paragraph is about an hour, maybe a half hour. And so to do a stream of like maybe 2 paragraphs is a beast. Part of the server reorganization is because I was spending 3 hours a day, at times, usually at least a half hour, just actually making edits and fixing things inside of it, dealing with random complaints, customer service, which is weird to do, all of that. Also, Wig, thank you for your try, in case I didn't mention. So it's coming. So when we start out here, 4.1 is about understanding the social field, is about coming to terms with that. And you'll see very quickly that they dive immediately into it. Some notes of things, if you don't know the story of Oedipus, the myth of Oedipus, his father was Laius, mother Jocasta. Short version, Laius was a gigantic piece of shit. I believe he's famous for being the mythical origin, not only of the Oedipus complex, but also pederasty. Yay, Greeks. Jesus Christ. So Laius had the oracle say, don't have a child. If you have a child, the child will kill you and marry your wife. He didn't care. He married Jocasta, got drunk with her one night, fathered a child, sent it off to die. Didn't, normal, biblical old Greek myth. Oh, no, I feel bad. We'll give it to a king because kings like to really raise orphans. And Oedipus grew to love his parents, but had the same kind of thing as, hey, by the way, the oracle say, you're going to fucking kill your mom and dad. One sec, I'm getting feedback from Discord. Oh, LJ, that's you. If you can mute, that'd be great. So in order to get away from killing the parents he loved, who he thought were his biological parents, he didn't know his origin, he left, and he went to go see he went by the oracles. There's a space that he ran into Laius, his real dad, who's on the way back to the oracles to find out about his son. Ran into him. It turns out Laius is a huge asshole and does some shit, runs over Oedipus's foot in one story, hits him with a whip with another. He's a huge asshole. So Oedipus kills him and his men, just fucking murders all of them. I don't feel bad for Laius. And then gets to this new city, finds out that the king has been killed, is missing, takes the spot of the king, marries the queen, his mother. And then down the road finds out that Laius was the king. It's the guy he killed. Oh shit, that's my dad. Jocasta kills herself and Oedipus blinds himself. All the way around. Important as we talk about the names. When I say Laius, when I talk about Jocasta, when I talk about Oedipus in the myth, these things are going to come up. So we'll make our way through chapter 4. Any last notes before we make our way in? Excellent. Off we go. The social field.
Wait. Sorry. My phone was not with me. So is there a time that there is a discussion for logistics? Like, for example, you said about the journal thing, and I can start a student organization and have a faculty involved, and it can be under UCSD or whatever.
We're not that. That's follow up after this. Right now, this is just this reading. We haven't had any of that. We've been just trying to get the server running and getting things flowing on that end.
Okay, so there is no recent plan to have.
There is no new plan. No, not yet.
Okay, so is that going to be relatively soon, like in a few days, or maybe it's not even certain yet?
Well, I think the next 2 days, generally people are pretty slammed or disappearing and out of it. I'm hoping end of week we get to do it. But again, The server is mostly volunteers, so we get when people get. That's how it works. But we can chat after this, and we can kind of maybe answer some of the questions you have. We can kind of solve some of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying that some of those is not like I don't know if you're recording right now or not, but
Oh, yeah, we're streaming on YouTube.
Okay, I mean, yeah, I don't see it on the recording on Discord. Yeah, okay. I'll join the reading today as well.
Cool. That's why we have the live with the recording button as the name of the channel. Just because it should be assumed we're kind of recording in here when that's on. But yeah, to go. The Social Field, Chapter 4, Introduction to Schizoanalysis. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? But also the father and the mother or the child. Psychoanalysis acts as if it were the child. The father is sick only from his own childhood, after all, but at the same time is forced to postulate a parental pre-existence. The child is sick only in relation to a father and a mother. This is clearly evident in the primal position of the father of the horde. Oedipus itself would be nothing without the identifications of the parents with the children, and the fact cannot be hidden that everything begins in the mind of the father. Isn't that what you want, to kill me to sleep with your mother? It is first of all the father's idea, thus Laius. It is the father who raises hell and who brandishes the law. The mother tends to be obliging. We mustn't make this into a scene. It's only a dream, a territoriality. Levi-Strauss puts it very well. Quote, the initial theme of the key myth is the incest committed by, sorry, stupid fucking page, fit the page, come on. The incest committed by the hero with the mother. Yet the idea that he is guilty seems to exist mainly in the mind of the father, who desires his son's death and schemes to bring it about. In the long run, it is the father who appears guilty, through having tried to avenge himself, and it is he who is killed. This curious indifference towards incest appears in other myths. End quote. Oedipus is first the idea of an adult paranoiac, before it is the childhood feeling of an erotic. So it is that psychoanalysis has much difficulty extracting itself from the infinite regression. The father must have been a child, but was able to be a child only in relation to a father, who himself, a child in relation to another father, etc., 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 etc. That's opening paragraph, kind of going at the core of the issue with the Oedipus complex. There is no start point. It is naturally forever continuing on. The way the complex works. A child begins unhealthy, which is great. That's a nice thing to do to kids. You start naturally unhealthy, and you need to become healthy in order to become a proper father. The father, naturally, as when you become one, then becomes that law, the Laius, in that. But it does pre-exist these things, so you end up with this kind of forever going back. That's the joke they open with, the chicken or the egg. These things seem to sort of imply forever, ever, 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 ongoing, 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 if that makes sense. It's a simple opening. This is the part we're going to be getting into. I hope no one has questions there. Does anyone have questions?
Can you go
there?
over that again, like briefly?
Yeah, so as he says, and he talks about, when we open with the Oedipus complex, which is the foundational myth of psychoanalysis, but really the foundational structure of how we learn to be healthy, there's this odd thing that happens. We have first, the adult comes in. The adult goes to the analyst. Analyst is like, wow, you have X, Y, and Z. You have X, Y, and Z issue because you weren't healed as a child. See, what you need to understand is, as a child, you wanted to do this thing. But now that you're older, you're worried about having a kid who's going to do it to you. This sort of goes back. As it says, the idea he is guilty seems to exist mainly in the mind of the father. The child is guilty, exists in the mind of the father, who desires his son's death and schemes to bring it about, as Laius did. In the long run, it's the father who appears guilty through having tried to avenge himself, and it is he who is killed. This curious indifference towards incest appears elsewhere. And so we have, first, the idea of an adult paranoiac, before it is the childhood feeling of a neurotic. It doesn't begin with the child. It begins with the father. The father is, as Laius was first told, you're going to have a child who's going to want to kill you. This is where this begins. It begins with the dad and then is visited on the son. But necessarily, that dad had to be a child. And this is why he also is this sort of infinite regression, because he was a child to another dad, who 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 was a, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the
I
idea
also think
is,
this has, like, yeah, sorry.
no, it's just an infinite regression is their point. Please go for it, Shosher.
I think also that it kind of like brings up like it resembles to me like also a little bit of like the whole thing on like capitalism, how like there's not just a foundational myth but like the idea of like first where we all have working class, then we enshrine ourselves further into like we have the middle class, and the middle class enshrines itself further, and you have a middle class, and that middle class grows, that middle class either expands or contracts during sometimes, but you always have a section of the population that is no longer able to be basically revolutionary and or like or secedes into serving capital, because it's also an infinite regression towards away from the alignment of the working class and towards the alignment of the bourgeois, at least symbolically.
Well, symbolic is actually their point. Symbolic by nature, denotation and signification within any sort of sentence that's ever spoken. The nature of them is that it is sort of infinitely regressive. Every word necessarily is defined by other words. There is no bedrock to the system. And that's kind of the point they made in the previous chapter as well, that there is kind of this everlasting, continuing infinite regression. But specifically within Oedipus, and this is where we're starting, the nature of the social field versus the personal. The father is the one who begins with it, who begins with the persecution, the paranoiac complex, before the child has the feelings of the neurotic. What's up, LJ? Sorry, LJ, I thought you had a thing. Fair enough. But we'll be getting in a little bit deeper to that in the next. There you are. What's up?
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
So I think there is something that when it comes to Marxism mythology that works in a similar fashion, but I disagreed with the description that Hofstra just give, but we can talk about that later. I kind of want to chime in here about how the more modern kind of psychology after psychoanalysis that says, oh, narcissistic parents think their children are selfish adults, but it seems like there is not that much of a gender differentiation when it comes to this part, and I think it's very interesting because the contemporary ones, they do focus on this area as well, but they don't focus on the regression. I think regression is much more interesting, but I think they do kind of recognize that the women play a pivotal role, an indispensable role when it comes to spreading this kind of regression, which psychoanalysis sometimes ignore. I'm not sure if this is like a correct perception, but it's very consistent.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of contemporary psychology that study cults.
Mm-hmm.
The cults is basically almost the same structure, but they never only focus on men. Like you need the other side of men in the cults at the same time to do this kind of regression. Maybe that's a different kind of capitalism. Who knows?
But I think when you're saying regression, also, I think you're associating the literally psychological like linear regression, like the idea of like something like something going like away from something, but also it's not in a purely negative sense. Like regression is also like an idea of like exponential degrowth, like or like logarithmic with a logistic like differential where it's like where change occurs slower and slower and slower, like there where the potential for something is way less. Like the potential energy regression would be like if a system like moves slower and slower and slower, so you have the less capacity for in the case of capital, you have the less capacity for revolutionary energy because you're so enshrined to either a middle class or something like that, and you have like you have a lot more to artificially lose, but
Well,
it's only
it's
in the
one of the.
symbology.
So the challenge right here is because we are doing a close reading of specifically we're going to stick closer to this text, and they're not quite making the same point in terms of the way that the class system works, although the caste system is going to come up here. And so the caste system as the early formation of that class, that's definitely the thing to be watching for. But what they're wanting to talk about is, as this book is focused on a materialist psychiatry, they're trying to actually tease out and talk about a way to shift from traditional psychoanalysis, which is focused on, in this way, as they're talking about, an inability to extract itself from an infinite regression. And it's less an internal regression of the person, but instead that psychoanalysis itself has this underlying fundamental almost flaw that it necessitates a parent who is paranoiac that ultimately produces a child that is neurotic that becomes a paranoiac parent, and that so on, so on, so on, that works in reverse as the child it once was produced by parent, and so on. So as it says, Oedipus is first the idea of an adult paranoiac. It's not actually beginning with the child. It's first about the adult, as it was in the myth, as it is in treatment. And they're wanting to start there as this issue because they're going to be sort of in I want to say 3 to 4 paragraphs, they're going to be bringing an autocritique within psychoanalysis about how we can adjust this understanding of this thing in order to do a little bit better work, which is what chapter 4 is about, the function towards schizoanalysis, if that makes sense. So we'll get to the class stuff. Don't worry, there's class shit in chapter 4. There's a lot of it. There's actually, I want to say, 4.2 and 4.3, it's functionally filled with it. But we're not quite there yet. We're not quite there. And so just to kind of keep this reading going.
So by better work, do they mean like more, like better psychoanalytic clinical work?
More or less, yes. That's why they move away from the idea of psychoanalysis to schizoanalysis. It's an overly, I'm not a big fan of the name. They think it's one of those early like branding cool things, I think. But that's very much the direction they're going, is trying to figure out, here's how we critique this and here's how we can do better and and understand the process.
I'm just like, I completely agree. Like I almost 99% agree with what you said, which is kind of rare. But, you know, a lot of people would, especially analysts these days, they would not say schizoanalysis is even clinical psychoanalysis. Like they would just think that's not even a correct kind of analysis. So just a little bit.
Oh yeah, no, it's going to be fun, but we'll be making our way through. Don't worry.
Okay, yeah.
Also, what I was more referring to is, I know we're not there, but at all. But I was more referring to like Lacan's S over S prime, where the signifier over the signified is kind of the exact. It's if you look at like that and what he says it represents, like the chain of signification. It's also, I think it's important to note that S over S prime is also the differential equation for exponential growth and infinite exponential growth.
Well, and this is, so on that, because I'm going to get to the next paragraph because their point is made fairly quickly. But as we start talking about what it means to begin with the father, what it means for the father to be the start of this, that is visited then upon the child, who is then told he is the origin of it. Because that's kind of the fucked up thing that's happening here. The dad's the one who's got the fucking paranoiac reaction, but it's visited on the child, who's then told that he's fucked up and needs to be healed, and lo and behold creates a paranoiac adult when that child becomes older, who then revisits it. And it's a hilarious sort of printing press of paranoiac to neurotic to paranoiac to neurotic, back and forth. And that's the deal, is this delirium is made, as they continue to say. I'm just going to jump forward. How does a delirium begin? Perhaps the cinema is able to capture the movement of madness, precisely because it is not analytical and regressive, but explores a global field of coexistence. Witness a film by Nicholas Ray, a Rebel Without a Cause, supposedly representing a formation of courtesan delirium, an overworked father, a high school teacher who works overtime for a radio taxi service and is being treated for heart trouble. He begins to rave about the educational system in general, the need to restore a pure race, the salvation of a social man and moral order. Then he passes to religion, the timeliness of a return to the Bible, Abraham. But what in fact did Abraham do? Well now, he killed or wanted to kill his son, and perhaps God's only error lies in having stayed his hand. But doesn't this man, the film's protagonist, have a son of his own? What the film shows so well, to the shame of psychiatrists, is that every delirium is first of all an investment of a field that is social, economic, political, cultural, racial, and racist, pedagogical, and religious. The delirious person applies a delirium to his family and his son that overreaches them on all sides. It's using a film as an example here, but this is really what they're saying, and this is the origin of this. We've got to think of this as this is what Leios almost did by bringing these things into the family and the son. He's invested socially. He's invested in things outside of his family. He's invested in all of this thing, this larger grand social field. But he applies it to his family. The father, and I'll tell you examples as a dad that this happens. This is kind of one of my favorite bits about this, especially since I became a parent. But the setup he's talking about here and that they're writing about is intensely accurate. A person inside of their family brings out the rules of the social world and visits them on the family. These things don't begin in the family or even inside of himself or inside of the child. The child is taught by the parents. The parents are invested in the social field, bringing that back to the family, almost visiting the world and returning with all of their goods, the goods of the repressive nature of the race and order and morality and all of these things that are then visited on the child. It's a big difference than, oh, we're born this way and we find ourselves between mom and dad and they're the ones we have to, no, dad and mom too, are bringing all of this shit from the rest of the world. The story they talk about is Nicholas Ray, by the way, phenomenal director. You should go watch a bunch of his films. But they're talking specifically about a father who bitches about everything that's happening in his entire world. Everything that's going on, everything wrong. Archie Bunker. Think Archie Bunker, like circa 1950s, who's like, can you believe this whole thing, blah, blah, blah. It's very Taxi Driver in that mentality as it goes. And then at some point, he has all of this pressure from the rest of the world. And at home, he goes, you know what God wanted? God wanted Abraham to kill his son. That's how he tested Abraham. I have a son. And that's it. He finds the metonymy, the metaphor, the connection, the meaningful connection with the social space into his world and visits that there. Goes to kill his own son. This setup, the film shows, as they say, to the shame of psychiatrists, that every delirium is first an investment of a field that is social, political, economic, cultural, racial, racist, pedagogical, religious. This delirious person, the person who's delirious being that they're kind of bringing that shit in, the delirium of I am Abraham killing my son. It isn't starting internally. No. The delirious person applies a delirium to his family and his son that overreaches them on all sides. It is not that it's a perfect fit. That's not what we're talking about. It's not that it's a one-to-one. It's that the social field is applied and overreaches. Hello?
Hello?
Ah.
Oh.
Yes, please mute. Thank you. I'm you're very echoey. It's okay. You can mute up.
Quick question. You said there's a stereotype, like a prototype, like something. You said something before the taxi driver. Like
and again, I'm dating myself as an old person here, so I apologize. Not as old as others, but there's a stereotype style of a person that was in entertainment especially, but existed in the real world. My grandpa was one of them, of like a post-World War II ex-GI who like goes to work, is unhappy, comes home, screams and yells about how fucked up the world is and how the blacks are moving in and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, you said a name. You said a name.
Archie Bunker.
Archie Bunker. Okay, can someone type that?
Yeah, Archie Bunker from All in the Family, which is a television show in the late 70s and then 80s that was actually about times changing. Archie Bunker is the archetypical, like very famous. Archie Bunker, yeah.
Okay. I just I'm gonna do some research. Thank you.
Oh, if you've ever get a chance, it's actually an amazing story. So Carol O'Connor, who's the actor, was genuinely like this incredibly warm, ridiculous, wonderful human being. And when they created All in the Family, he was a real actor, like a phenomenal I want to say he was in The Iceman Cometh or some crazy shit. Like, he was a real actor. And the guy who was making All in the Family wanted to make this show that was politically forward. Like, he was actively political in a ridiculous way, especially for the time even. And so the show like had homosexuality. The show had his wife having to deal with his infidelity, but also her own place as she's growing. They're older people, but what does it mean for women's liberation for a 60-year-old woman? Like, crazy stories like that just at the time was not on TV. All in the Family broke ground in ways that are really hard to even describe. Highly, highly recommended just overall as a thing. But that setup is completely worth sort of diving into, because this is that time frame. And my grandfather was the story that's told here, a racist old weird guy who's then visiting that on his kids and the world of his kids and his grandkids. It was a fun time. And so that strange interaction is not that the family is where it starts and moves outwards. It's the opposite. It starts socially, and then he applies these things metonymously, almost mimetically, metaphorically into the family. Oh, I have a child as well. I have that. If that makes sense. That's the sort of push that's happening here. If that makes sense. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. Nicholas Ray is phenomenal director, by the way. Rebel Without a Cause, larger, bigger than life, and King of Kings, whole bunch of stuff. But the setup that they're talking about here is that archetype of the era. The old man who's angry at the world and visiting it. I'm a big fan of this stuff. All right. To continue though, because I don't want to go too terribly far over everything, but yeah, Wicked in YouTube says, my grandma always asked me who my colored friends' names were. Yeah. I think my first real exposure to like what I would say is more traditional racism rather than like soft racism. Soft racism's hard to pick out when you're a little kid because you just don't know it. Like Song of the South, you can watch and you don't think twice about it because you're 5. But when grandma says, look, the blacks are moving in the neighborhood, why is that happening? You go, oh, and it's a moment that sticks in your brain. Really sticks into your brain. And she was outside Detroit, and it was about Arabic people moving in, which Dearborn's filled with them. So that's the way that goes. But to continue reading our wonderful, wonderful book here, because we're going to be moving continually into this point where we talk about this specific issue and how they solve it. Joseph Goebbels, presenting a case of paranoiac delirium with a strong politico-erotic content replete with suggestions for social reform, believes it possible to say that such a case is rare, that, moreover, its origins are not reconstructible. Yet it is evident that there is never a delirium that does not possess this characteristic to a high degree, and that is not originally economic, political, and so forth, before being crushed into the psychiatric and psychoanalytic treadmill. Judge Schreber would not deny this, nor his father, who invented the Pamgymnasticon and a general pedagogical system. I'll come back to this in a second. Everything changes. Then, the infinite regression forced us to postulate a primacy of the father, but an always relative and hypothetical primacy that carried us to infinity, barring a shift into the position of an absolute primary father. But it is clear that the viewpoint of regression is the result of abstraction. When we say the father is first in relation to the child, this proposition, devoid of meaning in itself, concretely means the following. The social investments are first in relation to familial investments, which result solely from the application or the reduction, rabattement, of the social investments. To say that the father is first in relation to the child really amounts to saying that the investment of desire is, in the first instance, the investment of a social field into which the father and child are plunged, simultaneously immersed. We'll take a second on this. This is as I said, their audio critique would come pretty quick. And that's really what's happening here. They open Joseph Gable, and he's not alone in this. They're just picking on this poor fucking dude who's immortalized in this. The idea that he's like, well, look, I have this guy who's like, he's got a delirium that's really politically and socially centered. How weird is that? That never happens. No, that's their point. They're like, wait, everything starts there. See, we say, well, it begins with the father who visits it on the son. This is what we say. But that means something different. What it means is, as they say that, the social investments are first in relation to familial investments. The son, who is a little tiny child, has, we'll just say, very little social interactions, especially in our nuclear family age. But the father is very, very, very socially out there. He's going to work. He's going to the bar. He's running into friends. He's walking down the street. He's driving around. Whatever the fucking rest of the world is, the family comes second. The father, who's out there, comes second. In fact, what it really is that the father and child are plunged into the social world. And then through abstraction, through metonymy, through metaphor, the way we're able to understand the world, we create a microcosm of it in our families. This is the point of the previous example that they use, which is the guy who's got all of these stories in his head about this, that, and the other, but ultimately about Abraham and how God basically tested Abraham. How did he test him? By having him kill his own son. I've got a son. That little thing. The world needs, I'm not able to get jobs because this is by the way, welcome to being a parent. This is the kind of nightmare shit. It's tough to find work because of X, Y, or Z right now. I don't want my kids to be in this position. I need to teach them better. They need to go to a better school. They need to learn better than I did. They need to not be as shitty with their boss as I am. They need to learn to be better with their boss. They need to learn to be obedient. They need to learn how to be a better capitalist. The parent learned their whole life all of these lessons, including the times when they were a child by their parent. And then they visit it on their child out of concern and worry. Why wouldn't they? Concern and worry for themselves, concern and worry for the family. They visit everything that they experience in aversion that gets placed onto their children. This is all of it into one. This is their argument and their critique of psychoanalysis. It's that it starts from the social space and that we as parents and also as children even bring it all in, and then we utilize this odd way abstraction works to find a match in our little systems, in our world. That thing. That's the setup.
Quick question here.
Please.
So, I'm not sure if I told this explicitly before, but I was born and raised in a place that these cultures or these mythologies and these texts, specifically the scripts, are explicitly destroyed in decades of efforts starting from the Cultural Revolution. But, I can say that most of people still function in exactly the same way. So does this kind of in support of the metonymy of these signifiers, or more like
it's one of those things that the structures that we visit into our children don't go away easily, right? And the Cultural Revolution is a phenomenal example of this, because even though all the words, and I would argue the words are very different now than they were 30 years ago, than they were 30 years before that. You're not the first person to say this. I have a bunch of friends in China who are like, things like the systems haven't changed. There's different placements, there's different arrangements, different ways that we sort of talk about it, but it's culturally, shockingly almost how little things have really changed now that groups of people have money that didn't have money before, or that have this, or the way family is treated. The way family is treated is weird now because it's trying to keep the old systems, but it doesn't work anymore. Some of the same way, like it's a whole different beast.
I understand what you're saying, and I agree. But I'm still going back to, because we are like you. I think you already mentioned the word metonymy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is this actually in support of metonymy, or is it against the metonymy, or is it something new? Is it something else where these there's not enough third space that allows for something in the middle that's not either against or a support this kind of metonymy?
So metonymy, I've been driving home, I think, a lot more. Metaphor primarily is what we're talking about. It's about the reduction of things via metaphor. Metonymy works very much the same way, where we have words that kind of have fungible meanings, or that we can stretch to fit what we need to. The way that a business guy is a suit. But when I say that, it doesn't mean businessman really. It means like look at the fucking suit over there. It's a guy. Like it doesn't mean that, but it does mean that. And that's so that odd way that language works. When we talk about, in this case, when we talk about, say, the sacrifice of the father, the job of the father, any of these things, what dad means is metonymous. It's able to be adjusted and filtered as needed for ultimately the social repression that's being visited on the child, but we're not quite there yet. But like, this is the thing that happens. So we have this really odd interaction where ultimately we have social investments that start first, and they result from the reduction, the rabattement, which we have a question just in YouTube. It's not so much that it means something different in English. It's just not a word people in English use. People don't use the word rabattement. It's just a fucking great setup. Rabattement. It's a great word for it. But the reduction, the way that on a map, if I were to draw a lot, like if I were to do topological maps, or if I were to flatten the earth into geographies, or if I were to draw a line from place to place that's really a more complex road, I've reduced the complexity of the thing to just that. But it works, and we understand it. We're able to get that thing. This is kind of what happens when we talk about how words are used. The complexity is reduced and fits what we need it to in the space. So we have this odd sort of interaction with all of these things. Sorry, Wig's asking, it means different than here. Does it mean different than here?
You mean mapping, right?
Yes.
Mapping these kind of. Okay.
More or less
Makes
mapping,
sense.
yes.
Yeah.
One sec. Just taking a second and thinking.
Brooks, can you full screen the stream so the text are bigger, or maybe put a single page on?
I can probably try to do that. Let me see what I can do. Give me a second.
Yeah, because just the Discord will make everything smaller because it has all these like dark frames and stuff. It's kind of hard to read very clearly.
Discord.
But it's fine.
On stream, it's quite lovely. Actually, let me see what I can do here. 1 second. I actually might be able to fix the thing. Give me 2 seconds.
Because I think I can zoom in, but it doesn't.
I can do this. 1 sec. This will be fun. Let's see. Okay. We're gonna try. I'm gonna. If you're in Discord, 1 second. OBS virtual camera. Let's start that. That didn't fix it. God damn it. That didn't fix it at all, Brooks. You did nothing. I did nothing at all. Terrible. I wish I could. I'll figure it out. The challenge we run into is.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I switched to my mobile and somehow it works. I can manually zoom in and then let it stay there on my iPad, but not on my phone or on my computer.
Weird. Discord sucks sometimes. Discord's a pain in the fucking ass. God, it's a pain in the ass to run. But let's in English, Wig says it's rebatement, and in English it gets weird. That's why I like the use of reduction is kind of this odd mapping terminology that's used when we talk about, and again, it uses folds, it uses a few other things that are very important to the Deleuze system of stuff, folds being kind of a big deal. But we'll keep going, because I want to make the next move to the next paragraph. Because this is where we have Gardner and the Marquesians. This is gonna be a lot. One sec, I want to make sure I get the source up on this one. Good Lord, because this is a whole ethnological study he did. I have PDFs. Oh, too many PDFs on this one. Let's do it. Let us again consider the example of the Marquesans, as analyzed by Gardner. He distinguishes between an adult alimentary anxiety linked to an endemic famine and an infantile alimentary anxiety linked to a deficiency of maternal care. Not only is it impossible to derive the first anxiety from the second, but one cannot even consider, as Gardner does, that the social investment corresponding to the first anxiety comes after the infantile familial investment of the second. For a determination of the social field is already invested in the second type of anxiety, namely, the rarity of women, that explains how it is that the adults, no less than the children, are wary of them. In brief, what the child invests through the infantile experience, the mother's breast, the familial structure, is already a state of the breaks and the flux of the social field in its entirety. Flux of women and of food, recordings and distributions. Never is the adult an afterward of the child, but in the family both relate to the determinations of the field, in which both the family and they are simultaneously immersed. It's a very good example for this. And it's very, very simple. It's said more complicated, I think, than necessary here, as they do sometimes. But we have Gardner has two people. Let's talk about the mother. Let's talk about a whole family. We've got mother, father, and child. Now, there's a famine happening. And we notice, as we do, that the father, the first anxiety, is the father. The first anxiety that is the father, oh God, I don't have enough food. There's not enough food around here. But why is he upset about that? Like, as a thing, like, why is he pissed about that? Because we have that first anxiety, the father's. It's a real anxiety. He's speaking it. We're talking about it. Well, the child is experiencing anxiety of its own, of lack of maternal care. With less food, there's less breast milk. There's less mom feeding me. But the child doesn't know those things, but the child is experiencing those things. And in fact, it's not that one comes first or the other, because it doesn't really work like that. Instead, it's that they're visited simultaneously. The child and the father both exist socially almost directly, but the child experiences this through the parents. Okay? There's no food. Dad doesn't experience it through mom or the baby, even though it's part of it. He's experiencing it. It's everyone he's seeing. It's he can't get food here. It's acutely through the child. He sees, oh, the child's getting weaker, getting thinner, whatever. God, fuck, that stress. But all of this is visited. But that's because at the same time, the child's experiencing it too. These things are together. Never is the adult an afterward of the child. But in the family, both relate to the determination of the field in which both the family and they are simultaneously immersed. So when we talk about the Oedipus complex, this is why this is a fun one. It is not that one is visited first, which infinite regression goes forever. Pick one, it doesn't really matter. But instead that the nature of our social system is that this exists and is visited on both at the same time. The nature of seeing the afterward as a thing, the nature of seeing the specificity of family and having everything visited through mom, daddy, me, learning to do that, having that repression come to us, how we visit on our family, these aren't different. We're all socially created. We're all socially created. But the child experiences this through the parents, the mother being basically the vein, the system, the connection with which the child would experience famine. He would see it and feel it through mom. It's famine, but he's experiencing it as being estranged from mom. Mom not being there, a lack of maternal care. How he's experiencing it, different, sure. But the thing that's being experienced underneath it is the social field. It's kind of a big deal. This is kind of the thing. Hope I did that okay. It's kind of a tough thing to explain. Generally, though, yeah, I'm good with that. Yeah. And we can go into the Marquesan story that Cardenet talks about. We went through last time. We spent way too much time on it, so I'm kind of wanting to avoid it overall. But it's a generalized famine, like a pretty excessive one, to be frank, and kind of scary. But again, it's not that the child and father are experiencing, the first is visited by the father, and then it's visited into the family, and then we have that. No, it's all of it is at once. These things are experienced at once. The specificity of it, the child experiencing it through mom, experiencing it as an estrangement from mom, and the father experiencing it as a stress about the child, sure, they're individual people. But the thing underneath it is not that there is always this inherent difference of father-son, or this inherent way that the father puts it into the son, or that the family comes first, or any of this shit. This is not the point. This is what they're saying. This is not the thing. To just say again, to say that the father is first in relation to the child amounts to saying that the investment of desire is, in the first instance, the investment of social field into which the father and child are plunged, simultaneously immersed. This is the thing. If you can't tell, they're driving home over and over and over and over and over and over and over. To continue. Hence, we are confronted by three unavoidable conclusions. 1. From the point of view of regression, whose meaning is only hypothetical, it is the father who is first in relation to the child. The paranoiac father Oedipalizes the son. Guilt is an idea projected by the father before it is an inner feeling experienced by the son. The first error of psychoanalysis is in acting as if things began with the child. This leads psychoanalysis to develop an absurd theory of fantasy, in terms of which the father, the mother, and their real actions and passions must first be understood as fantasies of the child. The Freudian abandonment of the theme of seduction. We'll stop there, take a second. In traditional psychoanalytic thinking, it begins with the child. The existence of the child creates the rest of this. And it seems silly to me. I think it seems silly to a lot of people. That's their point, actually. It's an absurd theory of fantasy. 2, if regression taken in an absolute sense reveals itself to be inadequate, it is because this regression encloses us in simple reproduction or generation. Furthermore, taking organic bodies and organized persons as its point of view of the Furthermore, taking organic bodies and organized persons as its object, the theory of regression merely attains the object of reproduction. The point of view of the cycle alone is categorical and absolute because it attains production as the subject of reproduction, which is to say it attains the process of autoproduction of the unconscious, a unity of history and of nature, from homo natura to homo historia. It is certainly not sexuality that is in service of generation, but progressive or regressive generation that is in service of sexuality as a cyclical movement by which the unconscious, always remaining subject, reproduces itself. There is then no longer any call for wondering which is first, the father or the child, because such a question can be raised only within the framework of familialism. The father is first in relation to the child, but only because what is first is the social investment in relation to the familial investment. The investment of the social field in which the father, the child, and the family as subaggregate are at one and the same time immersed. The primacy of the social field as the terminus of the investment of desire defines the cycle and the states through which a subject passes. The second error of psychoanalysis, made just as it was completing the separation of sexuality from reproduction, lies in having remained captive to an unrepentant familialism that condemned it to evolve solely within the movement of regression or progression. Even the psychoanalytic conception of repetition remains captive to such movement. There's a lot happening here when we talk about how we get to the point of one thing or another. Why do we put the primacy of the family first? Where did it start? Where did your neuroses start? Blah, blah. It started because your child is existing and a threat to you, which begins this sort of nightmarish sort of setup. But the big deal, as they're saying, is generally speaking, it's easy. The father is first in relation to the child, but only because what is first is social in relation to familial. Familialism is itself sort of the sickness that they're talking about here. The idea that the family is how we adjust. The family is what makes us who we are. These are parts that have spoken to me significantly. If you've ever known people who went sideways and then their family gets blamed, which happens a lot, actually. Bad family, not a bad society. Why would we ever say that? Society's just fine, but the family is really, God, you're responsible for your child. It's your job to make them better. It's your job to fix them, blah, 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 blah. This is how this works now, especially in America. It's really a fun time. What can I say? But that's the setup. But with this, as it was completing the separation of sexuality from reproduction is kind of a big sentence to say what's happening here. It's a little bit set up and complicated. Let's make our way through. If regression is taken in an absolute sense, reveals itself to be inadequate, it is because this regression encloses us in simple reproduction or generation. We have organic bodies. We have actual reproduction that we are capable of as a thing. Taking organic bodies and organized persons as its object, the theory of regression merely attains the object of reproduction. This point of view of the cycle alone is categorical and absolute because it attains production as the subject of reproduction, which is to say it attains the process of autoproduction of the unconscious. This creates this productive capacity in the symbolic order specifically, amongst symbols, amongst this symbolic metonymous metaphorical space that is ongoing within the family. This is how you end up with that dad versus Randy in my case. Or if I can put dad or whatever, or mom or whatever in your position. We have this odd thing that happens where we have the reproduction of the symbolic that becomes baseline for us. And so as children, we have this, I'm your father, listen to me. Your mother, do what your mother says, blah, blah, blah. Your mother, you're blah, blah, blah. But that symbolic setup inside of us, it's weird because it's not actually generating new things, but it seems like it is. Right? It's symbolically generating and producing, but it's not new stuff. But it seems like it's new stuff, which is cool. That's fun. New stuff is fun as a thing. And so you end up in this odd place where we have the father in first relation to the child, but only because the social investment is relation to familial. The primacy of the social field as the terminus of the investment of desire defines the cycle. In the social field is where desire ends. It's always invested socially. It ends there. The family becomes where desire is seemingly ensconced and expressed. And so we, to go back to the character they were talking about, the dad screaming about how, the races used to know their place. Women used to know their place. Things used to be better. Work used to be better, blah, blah. He's bitching about the social world, but he's then applying it to family, and he applies it very directly to family. This setup and this sort of interplay is the big deal. And this is the thing they're talking about, the second error. Made just as it was completing the separation of sexuality from reproduction, because it's not about desire anymore. It's now about the sublimation to words, to abstractions, to these other things. Lies in having remained captive to this familialism that condemned it to evolve solely in the movement of regression or progression. I leave that open. That's complex language. I'm not going to pretend to even beat that up. There's a lot happening there that I'm not. Again, this is Guattari when he's doing his work, and it's deeply psychoanalytic language that I've got to spend more time with, to say the least. There's a lot happening there. So I leave it open if anyone wants to comment, but I'm happy to also continue. I also may actually pull out the French. Let me see what I can do here. 1 second, everyone. Let me see what I've got. Because I think I want to just see what the original translation of that is. Because it's just, when you get to this complex language every time, my experience, you end up in this really weird place where, 1 sec. L'anti-Oedipe. Where is my PDF? All right, good. That didn't change your guys. We'll go with... Just 1 sec. All right. Just give me a second to read. Sorry, apologies. I'll make my way back in just a moment. Because I'm not necessarily great at French, and I'm not going to say it out loud for anyone to critique my hilarious and embarrassing accent, which is just how that works. All right. Found the paragraph. It's 327 in the French if anyone wants to join in. It's the paragraph that begins de la nécessité de maintenir trois conclusions, which is not a good French accent at all. But let's see what we've got. See, it's interesting. The phrasing is just a bit different. So let's bitch for a minute about translation. Sorry, you get to join me on the journey. I don't care. The English has, hence we are confronted with three unavoidable conclusions. But the French and how it's sort of phrased is actually, hence the necessity, de la nécessité de maintenir trois conclusions, to maintain three conclusions. We're not confronted by three unavoidable conclusions. It's actually, that's a very different sentence. Because ultimately we're coming off of the previous paragraph where we're talking about the way that necessarily the social field is visited by the father and child at the same time. This is it's very frustrating sometimes. But we're talking about this second thing. So if regression taken to an absolute sense reveals itself to be inadequate, it's because regression encloses a simple reproduction. If regression taken absolutely proves inadequate, it's because it confines us to simple reproduction or generation. The enclosing is fascinating. So, okay. How I would probably read this very, very differently in the French. So regression itself in the first bit, they're talking here from the point of view of regression, which only makes sense hypothetically. It's the father who's primary in relation. It's the paranoid father who Oedipalizes his child. Guilt is an idea projected by the father before being an internal feeling experienced by the son. The first mistake of psychoanalysis is to act as if things began with the child. This leads psychoanalysis to develop an absurd theory of fantasy, according to which the father, mother, their real actions and passions must first be understood as a child's fantasies, which is just different enough. I find translations frustrating. So that is the first bit. And so if regression taken absolutely proves inadequate, it's because it confines us to simple reproduction or generation. The nature of regression, because it is being visited on the child and it's not actually being dealt with by the parents, more or less what they're saying is that by starting with regression, we move to, well, what does this look like to the child? Which means we have to move to an almost abstract space immediately, a symbolic space immediately. Because we don't know the fucking child's anything. They're a child. You can ask my son how he feels about anything. Do you want to know how he'll respond? He might make a fart noise. It's fine. He's 7. They don't, this isn't, oh yes, Father, I think regression properly done, depending on what's been happening. That's not how that works. So when we do this, we've actually confined ourselves to simple and simplistic reproduction and generation. And even then, with organic bodies and organized persons, it only reaches the object of reproduction. So I like the language slightly better there. The theory of regression merely attains the object of reproduction. That's not what we're saying, actually. That's not the sentence. That's frustrating. Okay. If regression is taken absolutely proves inadequate, it's because it confines us to simple reproduction or generation. And even then, with organic bodies and organized persons, it only reaches the object of reproduction. So we're only actually reaching the object of reproduction, not actual reproduction itself, not in any meaningful way, because we have the organic body and organized person. So as such, regression only ever reaches the object of reproduction, not actual genesis of a new thing itself, obviously. It's symbolic. Only the viewpoint of the cycle is categorical and absolute, because it reaches production as the subject of reproduction. That is to say, the process of self-production, auto-production of the unconscious, the unity of history and nature, homo natura, homo historia. Only the viewpoint of the cycle is categorical and absolute, because it reaches production as the subject of reproduction. It reaches production as the subject of reproduction, as the process of self-production of the unconscious. Man, that feels like that's a lot more than my brain is giving it credit for. What did I learn French? I have a pen that does translations I bought that's actually was primarily apparently for Chinese students coming to America. There's a World Pen, I think it's called. And you literally scan and then it reads it out loud. And then you can have it read it out loud in the tongue that it's in and then in English. And so you can kind of just like read, and when you don't understand something, you scan it, and then it'll read it out loud and then tell you what the word is. And then I also watch a shit ton of movies that are French with French subtitles, which, by the way, helps wildly, like immensely helpful, those two things. Duolingo helped for like 20 minutes. Beyond that, talking to people in French when I can, which doesn't happen. So, apologies, you're getting to watch me learn about this one in real time, so that's the way it works. But it's fascinating, actually. So the complex interaction that's actually forming here that they're going over is the nature of the regression that is being taken to the family. Once this happens inside of the family, they've got kind of the second step. So the first, because we're talking about multiple steps at this point, which is kind of this is the thrust of the thing, the process of the thing that they're talking about, right? At least I think so. At least that's how I read it. I might be wrong. But that setup that they're phrasing here then talks about the creation, because we only reach the object of reproduction. The object of reproduction, mom, dad, because we have organic bodies and organized persons. It only reaches the object. Only the viewpoint of the cycle is categorical and absolute. And that phrasing is interesting, because that is not how they phrase it. The point of view of the cycle alone is categorical and absolute, is how it's translated. Which isn't far off. That's fine. It's certainly not sexuality that serves generation. This is one of those things when we go back to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is a focus on how reproduction has shifted, how creation has shifted, where once it was the production of more people, the productive capacity of man and reproduction was directly socially determined. You had kids with someone because of a whole bunch of social things. There wasn't like, I love this person, so therefore we have kids, which is divorced from the society in the way that it's discussed. This shift over time is kind of the big deal. This is why they take the path of incest through chapter 3. It's about the reproduction, the genesis, the generative realities of us, of humans, how it's changed and how reproduction now is that of simulacra representation, how it's shifted. And they're carrying that through here kind of quite a bit. And when they say it's not sexuality that serves generation, it's progressive or regressive generation that serves sexuality as a cyclical movement through which the unconscious, remaining always subject, reproduces itself. The image of thought that exists within us, that is part of that is imparted on us by the familial process, recounts itself everywhere it goes. Someone earlier in the chat wrote, "We are pattern-making machines." Yes, where's the pattern? What pattern are we using? What is the pattern? Because we're pattern-making machines, absolutely. But this is taught to us. If you haven't been around a child, this takes time. Recognition of patterns is a thing that has to be taught. This is how you learn from very early on where letters are, because you don't even understand that a straight line exists. You have to be taught that that's a line, that the continuous nature of that blackness against the white, that contrast is a line. This becomes a pattern that you start to see. You are taught patterns. Well, where do those patterns come from? Their argument here, and it's, their argument through the whole book, but it's stated, I think, pretty plainly here, that that's what's happening. This framework is being visited on the child. And so we have, as they say, the cyclical movement through which the unconscious, remaining subject, reproduces itself. Because we and our subjectivity were created within the family. In this unique type of reproductive system, we're recreating ourselves everywhere. My relationship with mom and dad, I'm doing this. This is how my subjectivity was arisen and framed. This seems to be their argument. It's good. There's no longer any reason then to ask who is primary, because such a question only arises within the framework of familialism. So we toss that aside. What is primary is the father in relation to the child, but only because what is primary is social investment in relation to familial investment. The investment of the social field in which the father, child, family as subset are simultaneously immersed. Subset, I cannot believe they don't carry over that language. Of course they don't. The primacy of the social field here's why subset matters, by the way. Most of Deleuze's work and Guattari's work as well when it comes to the social field of capitalism is based on set theory and the understanding of sets and axiomatics. So when we talk about subsets or sets, the nature of what they're talking about is within these types of processes. And the processes of a set are determined by the axioms within it. So subsets would also be this, the nature of sets of subsets. This is the language they use throughout chapter 3, and they will continue to use throughout chapter 4. This is going to be a long reading. Please.
Can I interject a little bit?
Please.
The nature of axiomatic is something that it's symbolic, but at the same time, when we talk about symbolic, we don't just mean a symbolic like numbers could be symbolic, monads in Leibnizian philosophy could be symbolic, right? But it's not a symbolic logic. That's mean that we return to the same like square that we first like argue about, and we argue in circles or tautology. If we say that the symbolic is something that is like a symbol, right? Express a symbol or symbolic logic, right?
Yes.
But it's a kind of like Deleuze, he kind of like returning to kind of sets of like not Pythagorean, right? Because that would be axiomatic. but it's a beyond axiomatization. It's a thinking of number, or which number is a symbol, right? Which is beyond sense and thought, right? Or
Correct.
between sense and thought, because, right?
Mm-hmm.
Between sense and thought,
Yes.
right? Like Plato, like what Plato said uh, in, I remember but like Hegel said that also, it's the idea that, like, symbols are not like just symbols. It's like expression of, a thing, like a number, between a thought and a sense, between thought and sense, right? It's not merely to intuition, like Kantianism, right? It's
Right.
not like the axiomatization of intuition, right? So it's not a mere symbols, right? Um, yeah,
I
if that makes sense,
I think so.
right? So, yeah, yeah.
I think it does. Um, I'm not. I don't even know how to pronounce your name. E8 says, first asking about translation issues. Wouldn't it actually aid in a schizo reading? No, it does not. So schizo reading, you have to remember, DNG are not talking about schizophrenic random free connections. That's not the setup that they're talking about. It's not free flowing ideas. By schizo, they actually mean autistic. It's autism. It's autism. It's not schizophrenia as we know it today. It's autism. Which is a lot to sort of process, and it retroactively changes a huge amount of the work that has been done secondarily, but it has to do with the timing of when this was written and how that sort of functions. So, translational issues for Deleuze, that this would be problematic in kind of a large number of ways. Specifically for Deleuze, the written word, and he's open about this. He talks about this. They're not trying to break down. They're trying to work within the systems as they operate. The necessity of the written word as it is utilizes despotic systems to generate it. The way that it enslaves the voice. The work within Anti-Oedipus is particular. They're very particular about the language used there. Thousand Plateaus, they have written what they've written not because they want random associations with words wherever they are, but instead to be a place that sort of allows lines of flight and random connections outside of it, but not within the text. What they write is intended to be what they write, and it really becomes difficult when we have significant changes. For example, just as a thing, flux and flow are transposed. Flux is an expulsion of liquid, an afflux, acid reflux. It's an expulsion. It has force behind it, and force being the function here, the pulse of it. That's why they use flux in the French version. They translate flux as flow, when at the same time DNG use courrier, Coule, which is French for the flowing of water. You'd say the flow of tears, the flow of water, the flow of a river. But they literally flip them around, literally flip them around in the entire book. So frustrating. Second thing you ask, excellent, E8. Particular areas of contemporaneous patterns may be taught, but deep underneath general pattern seeking machine. Well, sure. It's actually not a pattern seeking machine. That's a after image. It's a connecting machine. And the nature of the pattern seeking machine is the connections that are built and the structures that are made, we then are able to see elsewhere. This is the nature of the repetition of structures. We're doing them, we're seeing them, they're going over why we do this. It's not so much a pattern seeking machine, it's the sort of connection and the processual nature of how this repeats then unto itself. Connection, disconnection with recording, followed by consumption afterwards. And it's not just one thing at a time, it's a multitude of them happening at once. So this sort of setup implies and brings about a machine that recognizes patterns, but it doesn't begin as a pattern seeking machine. Instead, it's discursive, singular connections that then are brought into larger scale structures, and that repetition drives the pattern seeking behavior that we recognize as the end product, but not the beginning product. And that's kind of what they're going over here, is that We've got to get back at that. What's that beginning product? Understand the rest of this. And that's kind of why set theory is important. As you say, set theory is more predisposed to metaphorical frames than a metonical perspective. Well, yeah. So their argument is the codes of old, the way that codes function inside of society, of old, not now, but the codes of like prehistoric societies were so etched into people, almost quite literally, with scarification and tattoos and all kinds of sort of horrific shit that sort of taught a person where they were, what things meant, how things worked. And again, the short, rather brutal lives that people lived. The codes of that were necessary to keep things moving forward, to keep survival going, to keep desire productive within a social sphere, that shifted to overcoding as the despot, the king, pharaoh, whatever position came in, overcoded. His place overcoded that. But capital doesn't do this. Capital deep breaks down those codes. And in order to sort of maintain the function of society, utilizes more or less set theory. That we have large-scale sets and axiomatics that place things into them. So we have a billion binary little tiny points, like a screen, for example, or like you're looking at me right now on a screen that has a fuck ton of little pixels. Each pixel is multiple little bits. Each bit that is personally going through the processor of your computer. All of this, think of it as being organized. Yes, no, set, this, and it's all just being quickly, discursively thrown into things. And this placement of all of these sets, what belongs in what area, how this works, this is done pre-subject. This is how capital functions. So when we get here, the question is, how do we recognize, how do we teach that system? How do we teach that pattern recognition, the recreation of those patterns? Because the social world, capital, doesn't give a fuck about any of these things. It really doesn't care. Like, capital doesn't care if we as humans live or die. It's not its thing. But desire wants to keep desiring. So we have, how do we organize socially? Well, we do this in the family. The family exists to create the repressive systems and to create the reproduction of those systems within ourselves, the subject that wants to reproduce itself wherever it sees things, wherever it goes out. Oh, I recognize this, mommy, daddy, me. Look, there's mom, there's dad. I see mom and dad everywhere. I see the things from my childhood. I see my family pet. I see myself everywhere I go. It's a hyper narcissistic symbolic existence, but I mean, I'd be hard pressed to find anyone who would disagree that that's basically capitalism. And that's their argument. And that's what they're running for here, is this last bit that we have as psychoanalysis was finally making that last step. As they say, the separation of sexuality from reproduction lies in having remained captured to an unrepentant familialism. And the phrasing that they have that I really like in the French, it remained prisoner of an unrepentant familialism that condemned it to evolve in the sole movement of regression or progression. Even the psychoanalytic conception of repetition remains prisoner of such movement. It's always about progression or regression in a line. Again, this binary, this familial position. That's always going to be the case. And then they move on to their third and final sort of setup. And we're going to continue, I think, there. Unless anyone has like a major comment, we'll just keep going. 3. Finally, the point of view of the community, which is disjunctive, or takes account of the disjunctions in the cycle. Not only is generation second in relation to the cycle, but transmission is second in relation to an information or a communication. The genetic revolution occurred when it was discovered that, strictly speaking, there is no transmission of... Now, one sec. I'm just going to... Because I have it up. I don't usually have it literally sitting up. I just want to just read and go, oh, yeah, no, this... Again, here we go, guys. Flux. Yep, fucking every time. Every single time. It's just like, God damn it. The genetic revolution occurred when it was discovered that, strictly speaking, there is no transmission of flux, but a communication of a code or an axiomatic, of a combinative apparatus informing the flux. Such is also the case for the social field. Its coding or its axiomatic first determine within it a communication or unconsciouses. This phenomenon of communication, which Freud touched on only marginally in his remarks on occultism, constitutes in fact the norm and pushes into the background the problems of hereditary transmission that animated the Freud-Jung controversy. It appears that in the common social field, the first thing the son represses or has to repress or tries to repress is the unconscious of the father and the mother. The failure of that repression is the basis of neurosis. But this communication of unconsciouses does not by any means take the family as its principle. It takes as its principle the commonality of the social field insofar as it is the object of the investment of desire. In all respects, the family is never determining, but is always determined, first as a stimulus of departure, then as an aggregate of destination, and finally as an intermediary or an inception of communication. Yeah, please.
It's determined, not determined, right? So, like I don't know, but like it's community and family, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a middle part that, like, dialectically, and to speak dialectically speaking, right? Community and family, right? And there's something that like especially with like because Hegel recognized that like that's the family is not a like natural structure, right? It's not like natural structure. It's kind of artificial, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and there's something, you know, I think we should progress, but like there's something in mind that remind me in the section of spirit, if everyone want to read it because it's incomprehensible, but by Hegel, but it speak about this kind of thing, this kind of phenomena between the family and community and the intermediary between them, right? And the divine law and the human law, and how the family is the divine law. And not to speak of divine law, not divine law, what we see, spirituality or these kind of things, right? When Hegel talk about divine law, he means something that, you know, something that is not like, you know, it's pertaining to spirit, not like religious or something like that, you know? You have to kind of don't go very far, you know? But he distinguished like the family as the divine law or something like that, which is something that I'm trying to grab on my, you know, understand it very like.
The phrasing of this stuff at this point starts getting really complicated. It's why I really love getting to this section, all of this chapter, really, because it is deeply dense and everything has like just in this one paragraph, and it's a small paragraph in theory. They've got much longer ones in this section. There's an incredible amount in almost every sentence that can be teased out and talked about, and it's a lot. It's a lot.
But the family determined by who? By
the symbol, the social.
Oh, okay.
Let's
you mean the community?
The community, yeah. Well, the point of view of community is what they're talking about here, but the social field ultimately determines the family. That's and this is where we start getting into, at least as I read it again, the nature of communication here is kind of going to be, because communication, they're using these terms particularly, and they're not talking about society. They would use that, they would say these words if they needed to, but they're talking about community, which is disjunctive. This is where communication comes in, how people communicate. Not only is generation second in relation to that of the cycle, the generation of things, but transmission is second in relation to an information or a communication. The genetic revolution occurred when it's discovered that there is no transmission of flux, but a communication of a code or an axiomatic, of a combinative apparatus informing the flux. So it's not that so much that we are directly communicating the flux itself. That would not be the case. Instead, we're speaking to it and almost around it, and that the transmission is these elements that are sort of that this is the code or the axiomatic. When one speaks, we aren't actually speaking the flux. We aren't actually speaking the thing itself, but instead we are communicating codes and axiomatics when spoken. That's an interesting thought. I mean, that's how I read it. Am I off? Please, someone tell me if you're reading it differently. Because that's in the French that it lands a little bit harder, I think, even. So the genetic revolution occurred when it was discovered that there isn't, properly speaking, a transmission of flux, but rather communication of a code or of an axiomatic, of a combinatory informing flux. That's the part that I think is, one, it's really weird that they changed that language. Is that far off? It is. That's fucking pretty far off, actually. Yeah, that's fucking really weird. Informing the flux. No. Yeah. No, it's not informing the flux. Why would it say that? That's not how they have it written at all. So this is why language matters a little bit here. So I'll copy the text into where do I have? I'll just put it in Discord and then YouTube. How much more informant the flux? It's fucking interesting. Okay. Again, this is how I read it. Please don't hesitate. If you're on YouTube, discord.gg/DGQC, join the conversation. Help me. Feel free, because this is where we start getting into the fun shit. As far as I'm concerned, this is the super fun shit. To be really blunt, I adore this a lot. Okay, so say again, the genetic revolution occurred when it was discovered that there isn't, properly speaking, a transmission of flux. So what they're saying is that the genetic revolution, are they actually talking about genetic revolution in terms of the scientific discovery of genes? Yeah, that's what they're doing here. Yeah, that's what they're doing. They're not talking about some other sort of thing that's more symbolic. They're being very particular. The genetic revolution, they've referred to it elsewhere. It's the, especially at this time frame in this era, you're talking about they're learning about genes, like literally fucking genes. How do genes work? How do they transmit? How do they work? It'd be 12 years later, Susan Oyama would write The Ontogeny of Information. Like this is the genetic revolution. And within the world of the genetic revolution, it's not so much that you're transferring change, that you're transferring that's not what happens. I don't pass on change. That's not what's happening there. There's no transmission of flux. This is why the fucking translation matters a lot. But a communication of a code or axiomatic, of a combinative apparatus informing that change. Okay, I think this is it. This makes a lot more sense. This actually makes a lot of sense for the text of the book. Genetic revolution occurred when it was discovered that it's not about you're passing on whatever to someone else. It's not that you're even passing on blue eyes. It's not that you're passing on anything else. Genetic information isn't passed on this way. This is not how it works. You're not actually transmitting that thing, but instead there's the rule base is what's being transmitted, and the rule base, the axiomatics or code, is what is being transmitted in genetic information. which enables, and that's the next line. It's not about the flux, the flows, whatever. It's not about this being transmitted, but instead the apparatus that combines, the combinatoire, the combinative apparatus informing flux. So when you have becoming, okay, as you grow, what makes you grow? Susan Oyama, go read the book. It's good stuff. As you grow, what makes you grow? What makes you grow in certain ways? It's not genetics saying you're going to have blue eyes. That's not the setup. That's not how this works. It's not saying you're going to do this, you're going to be smart, you're going to be this. You may have genes that push you in-ish one way or another, but what is actually happening is genes are more or less the sorting mechanisms of larger proteins, larger fats, everything else, all the other stuff that is the material that makes you up. The apparatus of combination informs what happens, but the environment and the genetics together is what actually makes you, that builds you through time, that's making you right now. The food you're eating on top of the genetics you have that processes it into a certain way. So this larger point they're making. Okay, this makes a lot more sense. This is fun. I hope everyone else is like getting something out of this, because this is interesting. So the argument they're making, point of view of community, which is disjunctive sorting, either or, placing yes or no, takes account of disjunctions in the cycle. Not only is generation second in relation to the cycle, but transmission is second in relation to an information or a communication. The genetic revolution occurred when it was discovered that, strictly speaking, there's no transmission of flux, but a communication of a code or axiomatic of the sorting mechanism, effectively, a combinative apparatus informing the flux of becoming. Such is also the case for the social field. Its coding, its axiomatic, first determine within it a communication or unconsciousness. This phenomena of communication, which Freud touched on only marginally in his remarks on occultism, constitutes in fact the norm, pushes into the background the problems of hereditary transmission and animated. Who gives a fuck about that? It appears that in the common social field, the first thing the son represses, or has to repress, or tries to repress, is the unconscious of the father and the mother. The failure of that repression is the basis of neuroses, but this communication of unconsciousness does not by any means take the family as principle. It takes as its principle the commonality of a social field insofar as it is the object of the investment and desire. In all respects, the family is never determining, but always determined. First as stimulus of departure, and then as an aggregate of destination, finally as intermediary or interception of communication. The genetic stuff, the way that you will build the world, the way that you will be built into it, they're actually making almost a one-to-one towards how genetics operates. The first thing that matters is this axiomatic, this communication of the code or axiomatic, the sorting mechanism that places things X or Y. You communicate this to your children from literally the moment they're born on, from how you talk, how you speak, how you hold them, how you move, how you get hushed tones, how you emotionally respond, what your effective response is to everything, whatever it is. This is what they're speaking of. All these things, you're not actually communicating a thing. And this is why axiomatic is important in set theory, to think of it this way, which is a sorting and predictive mechanism, not necessarily a determining mechanism, which seems weird to talk about it that way, but I'll get to why. When I tell my son as a thing what a man is, it's not so much that I'm communicating that's content, you almost could say. And again, we'll go with Yelmslev here. That's content, but how I'm doing it, what I'm actually communicating, are the sorting mechanisms that allow that pattern recognition and understanding to be enforced and found. That's the first thing that happens. They say that. Axiomatic first determinate within communication of unconscious. This odd phenomena, the communication of the unconscious, is sorting. How I sort, how other things are sorted. That's the first thing that's communicated. This is the genetic material that is passed on. This is the first thing that is communicated. So the first thing that the son has to repress is the parent's unconscious, both of their unconsciouses. That repression means that they've carried on their parents' whatever shit. They've got their parents' sorting mechanisms. which they are not their own, resulting in neurosis, resulting in disconnection. This communication of unconsciousness does not by any means take the family as its principle. It's not about the family that comes first. It takes as its principle the commonality of the social field, as it is the object of the investment of desire. The child, how to put, a patient goes to an analyst having issues because they've got, at large, they're feeling generally unsuccessful. A general neurotic sort of behavior. This is not a wild one. It's not crazy. It's not so much. The parent may have loved them their entire lives, may have said that you're the best thing ever, communicated over and over. But the pattern recognition, the unconscious of the father, that is actually the first thing to be communicated, the actual genetic material that is not my 6'6" my giant fucking huge body. That's not what's communicated with my father's genetic material. The building blocks are the thing. And understanding that means that when my father passed on and I didn't repress my fucking dad's general insecurities or how he viewed himself or the genetic material of how he sorted the discursive, disjunctive elements, those visited into me, became part of my but they aren't my lived experience. They're not my thing. I've got these weird little lessons and sorting mechanisms for patterns that create the neuroses and this sort of odd thing. Primarily, they exist first socially. This isn't because of the family. Just my dad was the one who was around me. But they're mostly still that social setup because the familial investment ultimately is just an application of unconscious investments of the social field. That's what they're getting to. So it's the next line of the first line of the next paragraph. So the reason they're using genetics, and again, feel free to just tell me to shut the fuck up. There's only like 6 of you here, so it's fine. But the reason they're using the genetics as the example is, and a lot of people I think get this wrong even today, the mistaken misunderstanding of genetics is that you're passing on being a strong person. That's not how that works. That's not how genetics works. Like, you don't pass that on. You don't pass on being smart. It's not really how it operates. You pass on sorting mechanisms that utilize proteins and environmental things that are around in order to build a person. That's what's being passed down unconsciously. Again, you don't pass down the things, you pass down the building blocks that sort. These are this is what they're talking about, as I understand it here. I'm going to go with that, I think.
What is the building blocks? Sorry, this question. What is the aspect of passing there?
Well, so the building blocks is probably the wrong phrasing because that's not really, that gives it an actuality. It gives it a physicality. Like when I say building blocks, it's like, oh, well, this is the structure. There isn't building blocks, I think is the point, that it's the thing that sorts stuff. The sorting mechanisms become the thing that then is in the child. The child takes these things. Freud, when you talked about occultism, he talked about sort of the way that it's odd that what really is passing on to the child is sort of the lessons between things, not really the lessons themselves. That as the functions carry on, the content matters less. The function is the thing that's being passed on. And that inflection point is the thing. So there's this odd, so again, to take it all the way up, hey, Oedipus is here. And I go to a doctor, I go there, oh, you have a child? And look, the child, as such, as all children do, the child wishes to overcome the father, usurp his position, and the son, the mother is a position of desire. That's why you are fucked up. You have a irrational fear of this, Brooks. There you go. It's like, oh, interesting. And yeah, your son is also fucked up because he has a fear of wanting to do the same thing, and we need to work on him. This whole thing, it's a narrative story, but it's passing whole bodies and symbols to a child. But that's not really what's happening. This is the after image. This is the view of it after the fact, and also being placed in a very contingent thing. Instead, what's happening is the general neuroses of how father is insecure in these various ways, or how father and mother view the world. They then bring stuff back in, but it's not whole bodies. It's the functions that allow symbols to exist that can be reproduced. So the child grows not really ever caring about kind of the specifics or the lived experience of any of those of elements or their country or whatever it is, but instead the functions are at play here. And that's the setup that they're talking about. The next paragraph, I think, goes into this a little bit, and it may add clarity to it, but that's kind of what they're talking about. Again, I'm not explaining it perfectly well because this is complicated shit. This is a lot of complicated
In what manner
shit.
the functions are kind of
The way genetic
Sorry.
code works. The way genetic code functions.
okay.
Genetic code, you don't have written in that you're going to be this or that. It isn't like a deterministic thing. Instead, it's organizational. Proteins, the DNA adds to itself based on things. It's organizing itself. It's organizing proteins. It's organizing fats. It's organizing all of the elements. And that's kind of what they're referring to, that it's more that's being communicated rather than the proteins themselves or the fats themselves or any of these other things, that it's this inflection point. Again, I think there's a lot here. I need to get better at this section of the book. See, the earlier sections I've been focused on so fucking much because they were the hardest for me. And then here I come, and now this one is a fucking nightmare. Love it.
Sometimes some sections, it happened to me when Hegel, especially in Spirit, talking about the same thing, which is the family and community. And I'm still kind of perplexed, but I'll search about it. I'll and I'll read about Suzuniyama, as you said, or
Susan Oyama is
reading.
wonderful. Highly recommend Susan Oyama's work. Evolution's
Yeah.
Eye is, I think, her other great book. She's got others. Those are the two that I have and have read, but she's got others. She's great.
She talking about the organism, right? Or the inner and outer organism.
Oh,
and how-
I can't. It's hard for me to even say how absolutely nuts it is.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's see. Boop, 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 boop. 1 second, sorry. I want to do the next paragraph because I think it'll elucidate some things. Is there questions on this one or comments that anyone can add or help in any way? Secret Agent, yeah, what is being passed on is not truth or fact specifically, but social and behavioral processes. I think that's what they're getting at. That there's the processes are what's being sort of added and shared, because like the unconscious as a thing doesn't, in their view and in the way they've built the sort of nature of the connective syntheses, the unconscious isn't a stage like it is in sort of Lacan's space where symbols are playing around and their interactions create the unconscious. Instead, for them, the unconscious is a place of connections and disconnections, and the connective and the disjunctive are those two steps. And when we have inside of us being treated the way they use the disjunctive here, community communication, the despotic is where the disjunctive is basically born. His overcoding, his yes, no, the need to understand meaning as someone else's, wanting the desire of wanting the other's desire. That thing that's happening there is what they're talking about. And so within communication, the disjunctive takes account of the disjunction in the cycle. This is the disjunctive that's being visited and born here as they're talking about it. Go for it, LJ. Josh is.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. What fascinates me about this bringing into play the genetic revolution is that, I know that I had this tendency when I was first making my way through the stuff to want to give a preference to, desiring production on the molecular level and saying, oh yeah, that's really, that's the true production. That's, when you are liberated from these, repressive, blocked kinds of structures, you're getting to really something more, not only more original, but in a sense more authentic. But the way that, so in other words, when they talk about what happens, the result of the genetic revolution was this semiological revolution where coding becomes understood as a necessary way to understand. If you try to use a more reductive, say a physicalistic way of understanding living organization and genetic organization, you don't get anywhere. It doesn't make sense unless you understand it in terms of coding. And so in saying that, he's not saying, well, he's not claiming that we're applying some sort of a scheme to describe aspects of nature that aren't, he's saying that they're there in nature, right? I mean, in the same way as in, A Thousand Plateaus and genealogy of morals, where he says, there's two, where it's Professor Challenger is saying, well, let me tell you about the molecular. He says, but that's only one side of the thing. The other side is necessary, but it's fraught with danger, right? And then he gets into the whole Helms-Levy and sort of analysis of forms and stratifications. And he's talking about nature, not just the way that we understand nature. And initially, I was wanting to see it as in terms of sort of our predilection that we have to apply to other aspects of the world, these structures and codes. But he says, no, that they're, so once you see it in that way, that is, forms and structures and stratifications and codes are in nature or are, then when you then go back and understand how the codes and axiomatics function in human culture, then you can resist the temptation to sort of moralize, you know what I'm saying? And saying, oh, it's sort of, we're erring, we're distorting, we're creating illusions. If we're creating illusions, then you'd have to apply that to the gene, right? The gene is creating an illusion when when we understand it in terms of coding. It simply is what it does, and that's, and to understand what it does, you have to understand, the molecular and molar, how each side, depends on the other, and I think it clarifies it, at least for me, in a way that was necessary. It answered the question why you need both, why it doesn't make sense to give preference to just this, this molecular continuous paradoxical production of we've got signs but no sign systems, and you've got just Hesiades and no without forms and all the rest of it. You can't just have that any more than you can imagine a natural world that's just consists of that without the forms and the structures.
I like that. I'm gonna have to think about that, but I like that. It's a fascinating.
Not sure how to help you with that.
Alexa, fucking shut the fuck up. I don't know why that fucking every time. Because it's an interesting shift, I think, and it's one of the things I'm gonna go read a bit more on. I know Holland in his book Schizoanalysis and Baudelaire and Schizoanalysis goes over this particularly, but it's been a year and a half since I've read. I want to go back through and really get a better understanding of Deleuze and familialism. So I'll be doing that over the next couple days. As of now, I'm not going to continue on from here. This is enough to let my brain need to reset and figure itself out. Because here's what I'm focused on over the next couple days, and I'm going to try to stream. I may not. It's holiday weekend. I've got a bunch of, I'm going to enjoy some time with my kids. Got some board games with my son, things like that. But the thing I'm going to focus on, I think, is up until this third element of the unavoidable conclusions of psychoanalysis via schizoanalytic critique. I want to really get this. I want to really understand this. The translations are just off enough that I think it's going to be annoying. I'll be in the QC Discord, discord.gg/DGQC. Feel free to join. If you appreciate what I do, please do drop a membership or go to patreon.com/DGQC and support it. All that shit's great. It makes it so I don't have to have stress around doing these streams often. Work is work. And I'd rather it be this, but that's not how life works, at least for now. But I'm going to focus on this. If anyone wants to jump in, please tag me. I'm going to create a little space for this in the stream discussion. I want to really beat up, and I want to really have I want to have more confidence in that I'm actually speaking about the right things here, because these last 2 paragraphs have shaken me and my confidence. Kind of a lot, to be frank. So with that, I want to thank all of you for joining. I know it's for many of you, it's going to be the holiday over the next couple of days. I hope you have a lovely time or a relaxing time, or time away from family, if that's what you want, time with family, if that's what you want. I just hope all of you are warm and happy, and thank you for joining me. I'll be watching them the next few days. We'll look for stuff. Enjoy.